Crossing through the hot haze rising from the arena sand, you can almost hear the echo of the crowds, smell the blood mixing with iron, and feel the weight of a secret Rome tried to hide for centuries. Because behind the grand stories of the Colosseum lies a truth almost no one knows. Gladiators and legionaries really did face each other, and what happened in those fights reveals far more about the empire than any golden statue or emperor's speech. And this is exactly where most people get it wrong. They imagine two brutal warriors entering the arena simply to entertain the masses. But the reality was far darker and far more fascinating. Every strike carried politics. Every duel concealed humiliation, control, power. These confrontations were messages, not spectacles. And when I began placing everything side by side, weapons, training, tactics, and real accounts, I realized an uncomfortable truth. The fighter you imagine would win probably isn't the one who actually would. That's why, before any superficial comparison, I invite you to do something. Step into the arena with me. Not as a spectator, but as someone about to see for the first time what truly happened when two completely different worlds collided before all of Rome. Prepare yourself. The story you think you know about gladiators and legionaries is about to crumble. Before we move on to the next chapter of this epic confrontation, let me ask you a quick favor, one that makes all the difference. Take a moment to check if you're already subscribed to the channel. That way, you won't miss the upcoming videos because a full series is coming with hidden truths about Rome, secrets of the arena, and battles that official history never told the right way. Subscribe now and come with me to uncover what truly happened behind the blood and the glory of the Roman Empire. Feeling the rough smell of sand mixed with the hot metal of the arena gates, I start by remembering what struck me the most when I dove into this topic. Almost no one knows when gladiators actually faced legionaries, and even fewer know why. The image everyone carries, two brutal forces entering the arena purely for entertainment, doesn't tell even half of the story. When I went after the records, I realized that these confrontations were rare, yes, but extremely symbolic, loaded with politics, social control, and displays of power. Many times, the emperor needed to prove something, that he dominated the men who formed his army, that he could turn any soldier into a spectacle, that his authority went beyond military discipline. And that's when those special events appeared. Those days when a small group of legionaries was placed before gladiators trained to kill up close, in fast, direct, intimate fights, clashes that didn't follow the order of battlefield formations, but the savagery of personal duels. When I understood this, I realized these confrontations were not merely entertainment. They were silent political messages, carved into the sand with blood. The most intriguing part is that gladiators were specialists in individual combat, molded as human weapons. Legionaries, on the other hand, were products of collective discipline, accustomed to winning through unity, formation, and group strategy. When torn from that context and thrown alone under the gaze of thousands, they became something vulnerable. In the arena, the legion didn't exist. There was only one man against another man. That made me see the topic from a different angle. And from here the connection becomes clear. To truly understand who had the advantage in these confrontations, I had to dive into what came before, the training, the techniques, the mental and physical preparation that shaped each type of warrior. Walking through the imaginary corridors where these men were shaped, I begin to clearly feel the striking difference between their two worlds. When I dove into their training, I realized that gladiators and legionaries weren't just different kinds of warriors. They were completely opposite creations, forged for purposes that didn't even touch each other. And that's exactly why, when they were forced to face one another, the clash was so brutal. I remember the first time I read an account about the ludus, the gladiator school. There, a man stopped being a man. He was molded, sharpened, broken, and rebuilt. The trainers, the doctors, made sure every strike was a calculated act, every movement a conditioned reflex. To survive, the gladiator needed to know exactly where to cut, where to strike, where to save energy. It was obsessive training, individualized, almost artisanal. They trained like artists of violence. Nothing was improvised. Nothing was chaotic. Even brutality had a method. That was when I realized the contrast with the legionary, who wasn't trained to shine alone, but to obey, maintain formation, protect his comrade, and crush the enemy as part of a massive organism called the legion. While the gladiator learned to defeat a single opponent in a confined space, the legionary trained to face hundreds in open fields, with shields that interlocked, spears that advanced in unison, and orders that could not be questioned. And the most fascinating part, the legionary was trained not to yield to panic. His strength didn't come from personal skill, but from trust in the legion, in discipline, in the military machine. The gladiator, on the other hand, learned to distrust everything, even the sound of his opponent's breathing, because he knew that in the arena, one mistake meant death. When I understood these differences, I began to visualize something inevitable. If each one was forged in such a distinct way, their weapons and armor couldn't possibly be the same. It was impossible to compare their training without diving into the weight, size, and purpose of each piece of equipment. When I began comparing the weapons and armor of the two, it felt as if I were holding the real weight of each piece in my hands. It was impossible not to notice that gladiators and legionaries carried entirely different worlds on their bodies, and that contrast completely shaped the outcome of any fight. A gladiator's armor didn't exist to protect him fully. It was designed to create dramatic openings, vulnerable points that made the fight more exciting for the audience. An exposed shoulder, a partially uncovered chest, legs with almost no protection. All of this made the combat more unpredictable and far more dangerous. But at the same time, this lightness allowed for incredible mobility. When I imagined this type of warrior standing face to face with a legionary, the first thing I felt was that difference. The gladiator moved fast, almost feline, hunting for any gap to land a fatal strike. The legionary, however, was practically a walking wall. He carried the scutum, a massive shield capable of blocking violent blows, and wore segmented armor that turned his torso into a small fortress. On the battlefield, it made him nearly impenetrable. But there alone, inside the arena, the weight of that protection became a curse. He was slower, less flexible, dependent on the shield as if it were his second skin. Alone, without the formation of a legion, his armor became more of a burden than an advantage. And when I analyzed their weapons, the contrast grew even sharper. The gladiator carried weapons designed for duels, lighter blades, more agile, made to exploit openings and strike exposed areas. His sword didn't need to pierce heavy armor. It only needed to find living flesh. The legionary, on the other hand, wielded the gladius, a short, brutal weapon made for close-range thrusting while advancing behind the shield. A perfect weapon in formation, but less effective against a fast opponent who circled around, breaking his rhythm and pulling him out of the stance he had trained so hard to maintain. When I understood all of this, I realized the fight between the two wasn't just about strength or courage. It was about how each weapon interacted with each armor, how the weight of a shield could decide victory or determine death. And that's when it became impossible to ignore the next step of the analysis, how each one applied their techniques within this clash of styles. As soon as I began visualizing the confrontation between the two inside the arena, I realized it wasn't enough to compare strength, weapons, or armor. Everything came down to how each of them thought about the fight. And it was exactly here that the difference between gladiator and legionary became the most evident, almost painfully so. When I closed my eyes and imagined the gladiator entering combat, the first sensation is speed. He doesn't move in a straight line, doesn't hold a rigid stance, doesn't try to dominate the center. He abandons the middle and steals the sides, circling his opponent like a patient predator. Every step is a calculation. Every movement is a provocation. He knows where to strike. He knows the legionary's first weakness is the shield itself, huge, heavy, designed to work beside other shields, not alone. That's why the gladiator always seeks to break the rhythm, attack blind angles, strike hands, legs, expose points, any gap the legionary can't cover in time. The legionary, on the other hand, inside the arena looks like someone who lost the ground on which he learned to fight. He was trained to advance in formation, protected by ranks, supported by the synchrony of the legion. When he finds himself alone, he tries to maintain his military posture. Shield forward, short strikes, contained movements. But while the gladiator thrives in improvisation, The legionary tries to maintain a logic of combat that simply doesn't work against a man trained to deceive, exhaust, isolate, and finish. When I read accounts from Roman instructors describing these differences, I understood that the legionary wasn't weak. He was trained for a completely different reality. His greatest strength was discipline, firmness, predictability synchronized with the troop. The arena destroyed exactly that. There was no order, no commander, no formation. It was him against a fighter shaped by chaos. And the fight in this context became a kind of deadly dance. The gladiator advanced, retreated, struck low, aimed at the joints behind the shield, tried to unbalance him, forced the legionary to lift his arm and expose his flank. The legionary tried to respond with quick thrusts, but without the protection of his companions. His reach was limited and his margin of error was minimal. It was at this point in the analysis that I began to wonder, did this really happen? Or is it just myth? And then I dove into the sources, into the records, into the forgotten accounts, and discovered that yes, these encounters did happen, and some of them were documented. When I finally dove into the historical records, it felt as if I were opening a door Rome tried to keep only slightly ajar. There aren't many accounts, and that alone says a lot, but the few that exist show that gladiators and legionaries did, in fact, face each other, and these confrontations carried political, social, and even military weight. The case that struck me the most was described by Suetonius, when he recounts that Emperor Titus organized a spectacle in which recently disciplined Roman soldiers were forced to fight in the arena alongside professional gladiators. That wasn't ordinary entertainment. It was a silent warning to the army. Whoever challenged Rome, whoever rebelled, would end up exposed, humiliated, turned into spectacle. When I realized that, I understood that these confrontations had a very calculated purpose. It was a public demonstration of power, a way to remind the people that even a soldier could be reduced to sand under the emperor's command. Another fascinating record comes from a papyrus found in Roman Egypt, mentioning scheduled competitions between soldiers and gladiators as part of local festivities. The motive there was different: imperial propaganda, celebration, display of skill. It wasn't an execution, it wasn't punishment. It was almost a celebration of Roman strength. Yet even so, there was a revealing detail. The legionaries who participated were always selected. Younger, faster, more agile soldiers. Even then, accounts suggest they rarely won when the combat was fair, without major advantages handed to them by the host. An even more shocking case appears in accounts of the war against Spartacus. When an entire legion unit was defeated and captured, some of its men were forced to fight each other, and also gladiators, to show the public the price of military dishonor. And that was the moment that shifted my perspective. When a legionary lost the protection of the legion, he also lost half his strength. The gladiator, pulled from his world, remained exactly what he always was: an individual fighter, adapted to the unpredictable. But the record that impressed me the most was a small inscription found in Pompeii, mentioning a combat between a gladiator named Hilarius and a Miles, a Roman soldier. Hilarius won, and not just once, he won twice. That made me understand that, in practice, when the duel was direct, without political tricks or theatrical advantages, the gladiator had a much higher chance of surviving. These accounts didn't exist to embellish history. They were there as scars of what Rome truly was, an empire that used the arena not only to entertain, but to punish, train, humiliate, correct, and reinforce its image. And when I connected all these real cases to what I already knew about training, weapons, and tactics, the inevitable question rose before me with even more force. Who would win in a real confrontation? Not the manipulated spectacle, not the disguised execution, but the pure duel. When I laid everything side by side, training, weapons, tactics, and real accounts, I realized this question was never as simple as who was stronger. The duel between a gladiator and a legionary wasn't just a clash of skills. It was a collision between two philosophies of combat, two worlds forged for completely different purposes. And when I tried to imagine that encounter without an audience, without political tricks, without artificial advantages, the answer began to appear with an almost uncomfortable clarity. The gladiator enters the arena knowing that every strike could be his last. He lives on that edge every single day. Death is his constant neighbor. His reflexes are shaped for individual duels, short, fast, unpredictable movements. He knows the silence of the arena, the weight of the opponent's breath, the exact distance between blade and skin. When I imagine this man circling his opponent, I feel the cold precision of someone who isn't trying to intimidate. He is seeking the weak point, the hesitation, any flaw in posture. He was made for this. The legionary alone is like a wall pulled away from the army. Yes, he is strong. Yes, he is disciplined. He has heavy training, immense endurance, and real battlefield experience. But that strength was built to function in a group. He shines when advancing with 100 others, not when he finds himself alone before a fighter who turns survival into an art. In the arena, the shield that protects him becomes a weight, the armor becomes an obstacle, and the formation-based combat style turns into a useless memory. And when I imagine the two moving, I feel the legionary trying to stay firm, trying to advance with the shield, trying to keep the gladius in position. But the gladiator doesn't fight clean. He attacks the sides, aims for the hands, cuts tendons, inflicts small wounds that combined bring down even the strongest man. The legionary isn't used to fighting without lateral coverage. He improvises little. He wasn't trained for the deadly theater the gladiator dominates. When I looked at the real records, they only confirmed what logic already showed. In direct combat, gladiators had a clear advantage. Not because they were stronger, but because they were better adapted to that specific type of fight. And in the arena, that made all the difference. But there's a final detail, almost ironic, that closes this topic with the weight of a precise strike. If we take the legionary out of the arena and place him back on the battlefield, the gladiator wouldn't stand a chance against an entire legion. And it was exactly this difference, duel versus war, that made these confrontations impossible to compare in absolute terms. In the arena, the gladiator reigned. On the battlefield, the legionary was unstoppable. And Rome knew this better than anyone. Gladiators and legionaries weren't just different kinds of warriors. They were opposing worlds created for completely different purposes. When Rome placed these men face to face in the arena, it wasn't entertainment. It was politics, control, and a display of power. Gladiators were specialists in individual duels, fast, strategic, and shaped to kill alone. Legionaries excelled in formation, strong and nearly unstoppable as part of the legion, but vulnerable when isolated. Historical records show that these encounters really happened, and in most direct duels, the gladiator had the advantage. But on the battlefield, the legionary reigned supreme. In the end, it was the clash between duel and war, between two worlds only Rome could have created. Before we continue uncovering the darkest secrets of the arena, let me ask you something quick and serious. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel right now, because what's coming next is pure revelation. An entire series exposing truths Rome tried to hide, confrontations no one talks about, and battles that will change everything you think you know about the empire. Click subscribe and turn on the notifications. Don't miss the next episode. Every part of this story connects to the next, and I promise, after what you're about to see, you will never look at gladiators and legionaries the same way again.